Happy Halloween to all who celebrate. And for hardcore Quo fans out there, happy Listen to Halloween Day. If you're watching, if you're listening, and you're unaware of what I'm talking about, I'm referring to a Rick Parfitt recording from 1985, which would later be credited as Status Quo. So before I get there, a little bit of history. In 1984, Status Quo did the End of the Road tour, which, as the name implies, was supposed to be the end of their touring, although a couple of years later that would prove to not be the case with different band members, alas. But we'll talk about that at another point. So they do this tour, and at the end of it, they have a gig filmed at the Milton Keynes Bowl, which was released on VHS. And unfortunately, except for the Milton Keynes medley, the rest of it hasn't really been released officially in audio form. But there's still time. There's one day, perhaps, this will become a reality. So that's 1984, and that's quite a big year because that seemed like it was the end. Then in 85, as you would expect, with the idea that the previous year was the end, there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of stuff changing and band members starting to branch out into different areas. Alan Lancaster, as far as I know, and as far as I've read, was recording demos and stuff around this point, some of which came out decades later online, shared by Alan himself. Francis collaborated with Bernie Frost with the backing of Andy Bown and Pete Kircher on a couple of singles, including Modern Romance, as seen on Wogan, and Jealousy, a re-recording of the 1982 track with a few added synths, which was also seen on Cheggers Plays Pop. So they've recorded those singles there, and that's what they were doing at the time, sort of a solo project, if you will, although with Bernie Frost, I believe it confused a few people at the time, because people were used to seeing Francis Rossi with Rick Parfitt, and it was those two. So suddenly it was like, who's that guy next to him? Even though he had been the voice on many singles in the early 80s, Lies, Margarita Time, etc., etc. And so, yeah, they were doing that, and they recorded an album called Flying Debris. Now, we'll put Flying Debris to one side. We'll get back to it in just a moment. And to go back to the Bernie Frost, Francis Rossi thing of like people would have been expecting Rick there, that same year they were doing this sort of little club tour, this talking thing, which I imagine was a bit like what Francis has been doing over the last 5 or 6 years. I believe tribute bands were also involved in which they performed with. That's what I've read. Anyway, if you went to any of these, please come on the podcast and let me know what it was like, because I'd love to know how it compares to the current idea of the talking tour. So, yeah, they were doing that over there, and Francis had all this recorded material. Rick was doing very similar, and according to the book, Excess All Areas, I am paraphrasing here, their manager, Colin Johnson, managed to get him a solo deal for at least one album, and they gave him, Phonogram, a £100,000 advance. Now, he used that to get his life in order. He got himself a flat and, everything else. He then threw the kitchen sink at it, it seemed. He says in the book, I could have basically, paraphrasing again, I could have basically just got a cheap studio and been careful with it, right? But they went the whole hog. He got in Pip Williams, he rented the big studio, and he also, for the first time, met John Rhino Edwards and Jeff Rich, who had been introduced to him by Pip. And in addition to that, they had backing singers and other bits and pieces. And they recorded around 10 songs for an album called Recorded Delivery. He did a bunch of songs, some very personal, Others were kind of sounded like that was a good time. There was a softer edge to some of them. And then there was also this recording called Halloween, which, don't worry, we're nearly there. We're nearly there. That's how that ties in. So Francis and Rick had these 2 albums, Flying Debris and Recorded Delivery. And after they did Live Aid, which was a huge thing in 85, where they opened with Rockin' All Over the World, Caroline, and Don't Waste My Time, their profile was lifted massively because they were seen all over the world. And unfortunately, because of that, and because of other contractual obligations, even though they'd stopped touring, they were still required to record an album. And the record label went, we're not going to release these things. We want a Quo album. Because, you know, the Quo brand, big, selling at that moment, and so capitalize on it. So subsequently, In the Army Now was recorded and subsequently released, with Alan Lancaster and Pete Kircher replaced by John Rhino Edwards and Jeff Rich, who had played on Recorded Delivery. Now, Flying Debris, sadly to this day, has not had any kind of release, really, apart from select tracks that were released as singles on the back-to-back deluxe edition. So if you want to hear what that sounded like, go and check that out. I think there's a couple of extended ones on there as well. And the Recorded Delivery stuff, what happened there was they obviously went, it's the producer that's doing In the Army Now plus 3 members of the current lineup of Quo. And so they reused them as B-sides. Not all of them, just ones I think that perhaps could fit into the Quo mold. And Halloween was one of those. It was released on the B-side of Who Gets the Love, which was a minor hit for the band. And to be honest, I was kind of amazed when I found out it was on that B-side, because Who Gets the Love is kind of an attempt at an 80s ballad. It's an attempt to take Quo into a different direction, which is what they were trying to do in 1988, I think. It was trying to be current and contemporary with those big gated drums and the synths and the different ways of working around stuff. And so, yeah, to put this song on the back, which is a completely different kind of a song, it's got that heavy rock and yet very pop style thing in it. There's something very pop contemporary, if you will, for want of a better phrase or genre. So, yeah, they put that on as a B-side. And I think a lot of fans, and I'm just generalizing, perhaps forgot about it because it's just one of those things where it's like, well, it sounds very 80s. It's not particularly timeless in a way. I mean, again, let me know your thoughts on this. What did you think at the time when you flipped over Who Gets the Love and you've got this song? No idea, I would imagine, at the context of which this came from. It was probably like, what are they doing? But it was recorded in 1985 by just Rick Parfitt with the 2, at that time, session musicians. I think there is a difference between the 2, and this wouldn't have been known until a lot later when, sadly, Rick Parfitt passed away in December 2016, and a year and a half or so later, there was a posthumous solo album called Over and Out. It had 9 new songs on it, although one of them at least was a recording of a track he'd done on Recorded Delivery, which still is unreleased. And the 10th track was from those sessions, and it was Halloween. And the reasoning behind that is because Rick had always said how much he liked the song and how one day he wanted to go back and do it. And sadly, he never got the chance to do that, so they obviously thought, let's put it on. And the difference between the 2, I think, is that the drums, certainly the elements on the Quo version, to my ears, the one on the Ain't Complaining set in the mid-2000s, the recording that was on the B-side of Who Gets the Love sounds heavier in terms of drums. It's a lot more gated. I think the one included on Over and Out has slightly lighter drums, although still to a modern palette, it still sounds like the 80s. That's a little bit of a potted history, if you will, of where everything came from. Sorry I was a little bit rambly, but now I can get on to the track itself. And the thing is, with this track, I've sat and listened to it so many times over the years, and I happen to like the tracks that were included on recorded delivery and subsequently released as B-sides. Many of them are on the Ain't Complaining and In the Army Now deluxe editions, and the mid-2000s release as well. I love them. I think Rick has so much personality in those sessions. Things like Don't Give It Up. He's not just singing it straight. There's personality in there. There's an attempt to, as a solo artist, I guess, make it bigger, show more of himself. And the thing with Halloween is it's got it in spades. But let's start with from the beginning. So you have almost like a big guitars at the beginning, and I would imagine that it's Pip that's orchestrated most of this. Rick would have written the song. It's listed as a Parfitt, Williams, Rossi on the Ain't Complaining thing, but it's just a Parfitt right on the solo album as far as I can see. But I'm sure that Pip Williams had a lot to do with the orchestration of everything, because it has got that masterly touch about it. So at the beginning, you've got those big guitars, huge guitars, that have this sort of eerie feeling about it. And then those drums kick in. And you've got the bass, you've got Jeff coming in, you've got Rhino coming in with sort of the funky bass. There's some really interesting bass work paired, I think, with like synthesizers and stuff there. And there's a lot of synthesizers, but it's very powerful and it's very of its moment. And I wondered, actually, listening to it, whether there was an attempt, perhaps, at trying to replicate or at least like reference or even be inspired by Michael Jackson's Thriller, because that had only come out like 3 years previously. And there were a lot of tracks, I think, around that era that had that kind of eerie, scary, Halloween-y kind of theme about it. That's just, what I've uncovered. I'd obviously have to speak to Pip Williams in order to ascertain like where this idea came from. But the sound is very commercial for that period, if not slightly ahead of its time in a way by a couple of years. And so Rick's vocal comes in, and again, like I say, it's injected with that personality, which we've seen a little bit of, but not to this extent. And we've got backing singers in there as we go into the chorus, and it's a big production. And there's something about it. It's very soundtracky. It's very movie. It's very almost like musical theatre in how theatrical it is. Like, I listened to it with my wife earlier today, and we both sort of said, it's like he's playing a character. Now, take that how you will, because obviously Francis Rossi says about Rick's rock voice and how that wasn't his real voice, or whatever the phrase is that he uses, right? That it's that rock voice. But in this, the rock voice seems justified because he's playing a character. And there are lyrics which are tied in with Halloween, but there's also like double meanings in there which you can read into it. And it is like I say, playing a character. And there's just so much loaded into there. My gripes with it would be that it's a little bit too long. It's a tiny bit indulgent, perhaps, because it's 5 minutes long. Didn't need the whatever you want style intro in there. Perhaps that wasn't the greatest thing, although it was probably only ever intended as an album track. The opener, I believe, to that. I mean, what an opener. huge production, probably more so than anything else on that album. So many things in there, and the notes that he manages to get to. And yet it's still it's very well thought out, and the lyrics work. Everything about it, in my mind, works. It's just a little bit too long, I think. Although it is an experience at the same time. I think he could have released it in 1985 while Rossi was doing Modern Romance and Jealousy. And I think he could have potentially, if they'd marketed it correctly with a proper music video, like Rick dressed as Frankenstein or something, something more visual that would have fit in with the MTV age, I think it would have caught on. And I understand why perhaps the record label weren't so keen on releasing or marketing this solo thing. I mean, apparently, according to Rick, it cost them £110,000 to make this thing. It was quite expensive, for the whole album. So, yeah, I could see why they would do that, but they missed out on a monster hit. And the fact that it just ended up on a Quo B-side is a real waste, I think. I think it could have been a monster hit if it had been marketed correctly. And it probably would have catapulted Rick into another stratosphere, like another thing like on his own. But that's just my opinion. I have read opinion that say they don't like it because it's dated or it needed improving or whatever. But to me, it's the whole experience of everything. It's the way the musicians on the record, it's all built up, and the you listen through headphones. What an experience. All of that, synthesizers and drums and the funky bass and everything, just absolutely brilliant in my mind. And what a shame that he didn't get to re-record it, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight and new technology and, just honing it down just a little bit more. So, yeah, tell me, what do you think of the song Halloween? Do let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you again for another episode of the Quo-Cast.